Okay, so chapter 1 covers several pharmacy abbreviations and symbols, and then chapter 2 gets into the basic math skills. Okay, why is it important for us to learn abbreviations in the pharmacy? So we don't give the wrong dose. Giovanna, what were you going to say? Yeah, so the prescriptions that we get every day from the prescriber, most likely they're always going to be written in abbreviated terms. So we're going to have to be able to interpret that to make sure that those patient directions come out correctly on those patients' labels. Okay. So starting with pharmacology. So pharmacology is just the study of how drugs work in the body. We're going to be studying pharmacology a lot this quarter. So we're going to get into various body systems and then the diseases and conditions of each system, as well as drugs used to treat all of those diseases and conditions. So the pharmacology book that you used in MOB, that is the only book that we will be using. So any other books that you have from MOB, you don't need to bring those. But most weeks this quarter, we will be utilizing this book. We don't have an assignment out of it this week, but watch out on the agenda for that. You will need to be bringing this several weeks throughout this quarter, okay? Yes. No, this is just a supplement, a really good supplement to the comp chapters. So any chapter out of this is going to match up really well to the comp, just some extra research on drugs and things like that. Okay. There will be an assignment out of this book, but never an exam. Okay. Yep. Nope. Yep. No exams over that book. Okay. So every medication has at least one active ingredient, could have multiple, and what we call excipient. What's an excipient? Third quarters. So a filler is one type of excipient. So excipient is just another term for inactive ingredients. So anything in the drug that's not actively working in the body to treat whatever it is that we're treating, okay? So fillers are an example. What are some other examples? Flavoring, yeah. Sweeteners are really common, especially in, syrups, medications that have a really bad taste. Anything else we can think of? So a diluent, maybe sterile water or normal saline. Yeah, good examples there. Dyes are another really common one. And then, binders, so things to help keep tablets together. The gel capsule part of the capsule is just going to dissolve, just, using that to transport that into the body. All of those are going to be inactive ingredients. It is important to note every drug, whether that be prescription or over the counter, is regulated by the FDA. Now, not all supplements over the counter are, so things like vitamins, minerals, things like that. But anything that is an active drug will be regulated. So anytime you see, a 325 milligram tablet of acetaminophen, that means that there should be 325 milligrams of active ingredient, which is acetaminophen, in that tablet, okay? There is a little degree of error that the FDA allows, but everything is heavily regulated. Okay, so I want you all to turn to page 2 in your book. We're going to start with the official do not use list, okay? So the Joint Commission has created this list. Any of my third quarters, can you tell me what the Joint Commission does? Yeah. So, okay, yeah, so the Joint Commission, they're a nonprofit organization. Their job is to accredit hospitals. So they go around, make sure that everything in the hospital is up to par. They've also come up with this list of abbreviations that we should not be using in the medical field, because all of these abbreviations at one time or another have led to med errors, probably multiple times. So just looking at this list, we have U and IU. Those are easily confused. So they prefer us to just write out the words unit or international unit. So two units that we use to measure different types of medications. Same with QD and QOD. So every day versus every other day. Okay, easily misinterpreted. A lot of times people will mix up QOD with QID. What does that mean? 4 times a day. So if you have an order that's only supposed to be given every other day and you give it 4 times a day, that is, high risk for serious reaction. Same with decimals. Anytime we're writing decimals, we would not want to just leave our decimal like that, 0.20. Why? Yeah, someone could glance at that, not see the decimal, and think that we're looking at, 20 milligrams instead of 0.2, right? So we never want to have a trailing zero, and we always want to have a leading zero, okay? So keep that in mind when you're doing your math assignments as well. Always have a leading zero, no need for those extra zeros at the end. Does that make sense? Okay. And then lastly, we have magnesium sulfate and morphine sulfate. So MgSO4 and MsO4. So 2 completely different drugs, very similar chemical formulas. So they just prefer us to write those drugs out. Definitely wouldn't want somebody who's supposed to be getting magnesium to be getting morphine instead, right? So that is the do not use list. However, you will still see prescribers using, I see QD and QOD still being used a lot. So it's important for us to know what those mean. However, the Joint Commission says that we should not be using those. There's another long list here. Starts on page 2, goes all the way to page 6. So this list has been formed by the Institute for Safe Medication Practices. This is another organization, a nonprofit organization. Now they exist only to prevent med errors. That's their only goal. They have come up with this long list of error-prone abbreviations. Once again, because a lot of errors have occurred due to the use of these abbreviations, okay? Once again, prescribers still use these abbreviations from this list, which is why we got to know what they mean and know how to interpret them. So a few examples here, HS or QHS, we still see that being used all the time. It really means every hour of sleep. We prefer to just say at bedtime or every night at bedtime. CC, we prefer to use mil. So CC is a volume, cubic centimeter. It's equivalent to 1 milliliter, but we prefer to use milliliters. We always want to keep with the metric system in the pharmacy. Orange juice, kind of a random one there. Some drugs cannot be taken with certain types of juice. So if you ever see that on a patient's chart or a medication order, that is what that means. So once again, it's really important for us to know how to interpret not only these abbreviations that we'll study every week, but the terms as well. So getting into some of these common abbreviations here. So starting on page 6, we can see examples of routes of administration. What does that mean? Yeah, so a way a drug gets into the body, right? So the first one we see is intradermal. What does that mean? Into the skin, yeah. Intramuscular, into the muscle. What about intrathecal? Yeah, into the spinal column, so where you give epidurals. Intravenous, into the vein. PO is by mouth. It really stands for per oral, but in English we just say by mouth. Same with PR and PV, so per rectum or rectal, per vagina or vaginal. And then we have sublingual. What does that mean? Under the tongue. So really important, if you have an order for a sublingual tablet, on the directions, we wouldn't just say, take one tablet, right? What would we say? Yeah, you could say place one tablet under the tongue or dissolve one tablet under the tongue, right? So we really got to be clear for our patients on the directions that we're giving. What does topical mean? On top of the skin. So what are some types of drugs that we apply topically? Yeah, ointments, creams, lotion, patches, all applied just on top of the skin. Frequency of administration. So how often we give something throughout the day. Anytime you see Q, most likely. So we have every hour. Don't confuse that with QHS, which is once again every night at bedtime. And then you can have, every 2, 4, 6, 8 hours, whatever number falls in between the Q and the H there. Hopefully you guys have seen BID, TID, and QID before. Did you guys study that last quarter? Yeah. So twice a day, 3 times a day, 4 times a day. Don't confuse QID, once again, with QOD. What is QOD? Every other day. Then every week, every month. You could also see something like this, Q3D. What would that mean? Every 3 days or every 3rd day. Some medications have to be taken like that. Times of administration. These top 2, before meals and after meals, always get confused, okay? So the way I remember it, it helps me. AM and PM, morning comes before the afternoon. So AC before meals, PC after meals. Morning, AM, PM, we tend to use evening in the pharmacy rather than afternoon. So PM is going to be evening. PRN is as needed. What types of medication can be taken as needed? What'd you say? Oh, NSAID, so yeah, pain relievers, right? Somebody doesn't need to take a regularly scheduled pain med. They don't have to. It could be as needed. As soon as possible. So that is a type of order. Need to, take priority over the new orders that you're working on. And then stat orders, they are taking precedence even over the as soon as possible orders. So how long should a stat order be done in? Immediately. So right away, usually, hopefully less than 15 minutes. Sometimes that's not always attainable, especially if you have to, make a compound or something like that. But, if you get a stat order, usually in emergency situations, they need that right away. So drop whatever it is you're doing and get that done as, right away. You'll see stat orders a lot more often in the institutional pharmacy than you would in a retail setting, okay? Dosage forms. So how a drug is manufactured or made. So these are all pretty self-explanatory. Capsule, tablet, liquid, syrup, cream, lotion. Suppository. What's a suppository? Yeah, so it's going to be inserted into a cavity in the body and it will dissolve. So like Jordan said, you can have rectal, you can have vaginal, or even urethral suppositories. We're gonna make some suppositories this quarter in the lab. That'll be fun. And then ointment, this one's a little different, UNG. Sometimes they use that to abbreviate ointment. Metric system. So this is going to be the main system that we use in the pharmacy. Why do you think that is? It's the most accurate. What else? So it's not really close to the household system. Why would we not be using the household system or the customary system? Other than it's not as accurate. So the reason I'm thinking of is the metric system is used worldwide. It's used internationally, right? Usually the household system, what we use in the kitchen, is only used in the United States. So when we're talking medicine, we're going to be talking, international. So like we mentioned, it's the most accurate. So micrograms and milligrams, we'll see that a lot with tablets, capsules. A lot of strengths of drugs are measured in those units. Gram, maybe if you have to make a compound, you're weighing out a larger amount of cream or something like that. Where would we see the kilogram? Yeah, usually patient's weight. Drugs won't be measured in kilogram. That's a really big difference. If we're converting pounds into kilograms, we'll do that a little bit later. Milliliters, most common unit for volume. So for liquid medications, we really don't see the liter used too often. What about liter? And it's not up there, but centimeters as well. When would we need links in the pharmacy? So if you need a patient's height, maybe if you're calculating a BSA, something like that. If they need crutches, depending on if your pharmacy sells those, or a wheelchair. Another reason for centimeters would maybe, measuring the circumference of a patient's calf or thigh to fit them for compression stockings or compression socks, if your pharmacy sells that. Some creams and ointments are also given directions to, apply a 1 centimeter ribbon to the eye, twice a day, something like that. So occasionally you'll see links used in the pharmacy as well. The household system, we're going to be working with this in a couple weeks. We're going to be practicing converting from the household system to the metric system because prescribers in the United States tend to write some SIGs or some directions for prescriptions in household units. So things like teaspoons and tablespoons. So we need to be able to convert those into the metric system. Hopefully these abbreviations are familiar to you. The only one that may not be is the first one. So GTT stands for drop. So things like eye drops, ear drops. And then we have the apothecary system. So that is the oldest system of measurement. Still sometimes used in the pharmacy today, which is why we're going to go over that. Some drugs are still measured in grains. So nitroglycerin, acetaminophen, codeine, just a few examples of that. So once again, we'll practice converting from the apothecary system back into the metric system as well. Abbreviations for eyes and ears. These always get mixed up. Have you guys studied these before? Second quarter? Yeah? Good. So however you can remember these, I always just tend to remember that D is right and S is left. And then from there, I look at the first letter. So A is for the ear, so we can think of the auditory system, or ear has an A. And then O is for eye, so for the ophthalmic system. So then if you could remember, A is ear, O is eye, D is right, S is left, then you should be pretty set. That way U is just for each ear or each eye, both ears, both eyes, means the same thing. Just some, a mix of examples here. Ad lib, you don't see that used too much anymore, but if you ever do, it means as desired. Dispense as written, we'll cover some dispense as written codes later on in the quarter. Very important for submitting claims every time we run a prescription through the insurance. Over the counter, one that's not up there is also BTC. What does that mean? Behind the counter. Somebody explain, what is a behind the counter drug? Good job, perfect. So you don't need a prescription for it, but it has to be kept behind the counter. Sudafed or pseudoephedrine is a really common example of that. So we have to keep track of, who buys Sudafed, how much they buy, but you don't need a prescription for it. So patients have to come and ask for that behind the counter. Quantity sufficient or sufficient quantity. We'll get back to that later on in these math chapters. And then just verbal order, repeat and non-repeat, pretty self-explanatory on those there. Okay, so chapter 2 is going to start getting into math skills. So covering basic math skills, okay? So this week's math is really going to build the foundation for what we do from here on out, okay? So I have recorded chapter 2 lecture on Moodle. That way you can watch that as many times as you need to. But if you're still struggling after you've watched those lectures, please set up a time to meet with me as soon as possible, because these basic skills are very critical for when we move on next week, okay? The way this book works, so each chapter is going to have a little bit of the week before. Okay? So a calculator will be available, so you don't have to do everything longhand. Most pharmacists will expect you to do simple calculations without one. So hopefully after these 2 quarters of going through this twice, you'll start to pick up on how to do some of this, relatively quickly in your head, especially when it comes to things like quantities, things like that. So I'm just going to run through a quick overview of chapter 2. Like I said, the actual meat and potatoes of the lecture is on Moodle. But just so you know what to expect, starts out with whole numbers. So goes back to the basics, reviewing whole numbers, how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. Like I said earlier, this book goes into detail on how to do all that by hand. You don't need to worry about that really, because we're going to have access to a calculator. And then we jump right into fractions. So improper, proper, mixed numbers, and then how to go from each form, how to convert back and forth. And then going into how to add and subtract fractions, how to reduce fractions, and then also how to multiply and divide fractions. So once again, all of that's on Moodle for you to watch. Next concept is decimals. So general overview of decimals, how to go from a fraction to a decimal, and then back the other way. How to compare decimals. So how you can look at multiple decimals and see which one's larger, which one's smaller. Rounding decimals. So this is very important. Please, whenever you're doing your assignments in your book, read the directions. If it says, round to the nearest 10th, round to the nearest 100th. This skill is very critical for moving forward. If you're not comfortable with how to round, please let me know as soon as possible so we can make sure that we get the right answers in the future. And then basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division with decimals. Once again, they go into the longhand version. We have access to a calculator. And then percentages. And then converting between percentages and fractions, back the other way, percentages to a decimal, and back the other way. And then ratios. So ratios are just like fractions, kind of just flipped on their side there. So how to read ratios, and also how to set two ratios equal to each other. So third quarters can definitely agree that this concept we're going to probably do every week from here on out, right? Ratio and proportion. So being able to set two fractions equal to each other and solve for x. Very, very critical skill that will follow us out throughout the rest of the book. And then lastly, the last section of this chapter, I think this is really helpful for just any word problem that we read from here on out. It gives you some rules on how to follow to basically change a question into an equation very quickly, okay? And then I go through all of these examples on those slides as well. And then lastly, I'm going to tell you this every time, does your answer make sense? If you get an answer for a dose that is, 2,000 tablets to be given every morning, it's probably an indicator that you did something wrong, right? So go back, check your work. When you're starting out your work, if you need to estimate at first to know where you're going to be at, that's another good way to help you know if you're in the ballpark of what you should be looking for. Okay, any questions on chapter 1? No? All right. Let's see.